Good afternoon. I hope you enjoyed lunch. Hopefully you haven't eaten too much so you're falling asleep in this. I know the after lunch slot can be a bit hit and miss that way, but we're still enjoying lunch, Jay. Welcome to today's panel on maintaining open source software. Hopefully we expose a little bit of the human element, both good and bad, of maintaining open source. And I've got some fantastic panelists with me today. I'm Chris Holt. I'm a user of open source, but nothing I've ever put out there other than the odd PR has gained any traction, so I'm the least qualified person up here. But I'd love to introduce you to Sam, Lorna, and Derek. Could you spend a minute or more or less, just give a quick background as to who you are, what you do, and what you look after?
Hi, I'm Sam Clements. I've been maintaining some tiny open source libraries for a very long time. The kinds of things that do process monitoring for Rust or colored logging in Python. They're really small, don't do anything that important, but get used in a lot of places. Color log can be installed on pretty much any Linux distribution out there. And I've been doing that for a very long time now, about 10 years, I think. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lorna. I maintain a bunch of different things, and I have maintained a bunch of different things. So I am a maintainer on OpenAPI, the open standard. I'm on the technical steering committee. I maintain a tool that you haven't heard of but you might have used called RST to PDF. And in the last couple of roles, I've also maintained a whole raft of things for different employers. So where an employer owns open source, I've also been their maintainer for that, either in a developer experience or a DevRel role. Right now I'm doing a selection of fractional and advisory work for DevTools companies and APIs stuff, but I am looking for a job, so you should let me know if any of that sounds good.
Hi, I'm Derek. I look after the PHP project, but that not just me, because that is way too much work. We have millions of users, millions of commits by now, I suppose, and yeah, the difference between such a large project and some smaller things that I maintain all by myself are quite different. So it's kind of interesting to see the difference of opinions that you get and the type of help that you get in your project as well.
So Derek, how did you start with open source? What's your kind of story in getting into it?
So for me, it started by wanting to scratch an itch. I'm going to date myself here, in 2000, yes. I was working on small websites for the local groceries and maybe not the groceries, but the local shops, so to speak. And back in the day, Flash was a cool thing to have on your website as your intro page when everybody has to wait for it to load and stuff like that. And we wanted to center that in the middle of the screen. Now, that is now easy with CSS, but it wasn't in the year 2000. And the only way of doing that was by knowing the width of the image. And PHP, the language that we're using, had a feature for that to getting the size of an image, but it didn't know how to do that for the Shockwave Flash movies. So that was my first contribution that got accepted into PHP. And because of using it, I started, then finding some bugs and fixing some bugs. I found out PHP has no debugger. So, okay, I will write one then. And that is now 25 years ago. So, I'm still maintaining that, mostly by myself. So that's how I sort of got into contributing to open source. And I've done a lot since then, both as a volunteer, but also for companies as well.
And Lorna?
My background is in web development. So I was a PHP programmer, so I was using a lot of open source. And I got really more involved in the community. I met Derek at a conference in Germany wasn't the year 2000, but it wasn't that long after. And one of the things that we did as a community is we had a website that helped us to show the schedules and get feedback from all the events and everything. And I made so many complaints to the person who maintained that they gave me commit access, and I never looked back.
Yeah, Sam?
I started doing open source when I was pretty young because I got into programming, had an interest in that and doing web development, and open source was what was there and available that I could actually do and use because at that point, I wasn't going to pay money to do anything. I was a kid playing around on a computer making websites. I started by making like a tiny PHP CMS, and since then, everything I've done that hasn't been for a company that won't let me has been open sourced. Whether I like it or not, whether it's good or bad, most of it's bad, but everything I've built I've open sourced and have a record on GitHub or GitLab somewhere. Not all of it's useful, but bits of it have turned out to be useful to other people, and they've picked it up and used it.
So, people picking up and using it, you've created ColorLog for a lot of Python projects use that. Did you think your project would get that kind of adoption? Did you set out to get that?
Not at all. I didn't even notice its adoption for a very long time. At one point, I Googled it just to get to the GitHub repository and found like a bunch of listings for like Debian packages and Fedora packages, and went, wait, what? No one told me about this. Then occasionally I'd get issues going, could you change this for our packaging standards? But like, it's very easy for a project to get adopted and widely used, and for the maintainer to never know anything about how it's used or why it's used or who's using it. It's a bit easier now because a lot of stuff will show like a list of things that depend on your project, which is really quite scary. But yeah, I never went into that with any expectation of doing anything other than solving a tiny little problem for myself, which is that I wanted my logs to look nicer.
I mean, Derek brought up the that XKCD comic with like LPAD or one tiny little unmaintained thing holding up the stack of everything else on the web. Does it feel a little bit like that? I know it's not quite that fundamental, but
yeah, it's not quite that fundamental, but it's like a little tiny block somewhere near the bottom of that is included in lots of things. The stack probably wouldn't fall over if you took it out, but a bunch of people would have to do a bit of work and find something else.
And their logs would be in monochrome.
Yeah, their logs would be boring.
What about the other two? Have you had much surprise in the uptake of stuff you've done when it's been library or application-based?
I did this the other way around, and I inherited a widely used library because I use RST to PDF for my slide decks. It takes restructured text. It turns them into PDFs. PDFs are very good for slides. But the project was very old, very well used, mostly by Python and Sphinx, and abandoned. So then I was generously included in the new round of maintainer arrangements. It's a surprisingly widely used library, and I didn't understand all of the use cases when I got it. So that's been some of the same challenges, but also some different ones. I can't wait to hear what Derek says about Xdebug.
Well, first, I'd like to go back to RST to PDF, because I've used it for ages, and then I see a new maintainer show up and say, oh, I know who they are.
Yes.
This is kind of funny, and RST to PDF isn't the only thing here. Like, as developing C, which what PHP is written in, you use a debugging tool called Valgrind to do all kinds of memory leaks analysis. And only later I found out that, like, maybe a decade later, like, oh, one of my buddies that I know through OpenStreetMap is one of the maintainers of this project. It's kind of weird to do. Now, on my own side, the debugger that I started writing called Xdebug, because, I mean, I can't name things properly or design nice-looking things either. But I wrote it for myself, right? It's like I want to know how to debug PHP anytime I write code in something, starting with Pascal. It had a great debugger in that you could single-step through thing. In C, although there's no, well, not something you can click with, but there is a single-step debugger. PHP didn't have that. So I wrote it for myself, and then some people started using it, and now I know it's successful because I got bug reports about things not working and questions for help. And I up till now, I can't say how many people use it. I know how many people download it, but that also says little because people might download it in CI environments now, right? But I certainly hadn't thought that would be like 1 million downloads every month, for example. It's like,
So,
never thought that'd be the case.
So you've kind of transitioned quite successfully into a professional career supporting open source, being paid directly to work on it, both through Mongo earlier on and PHP Foundation now. How has that changed your contribution and maintenance kind of approach, if any?
Yeah, that comes in like waves. So when I started contributing to PHP, I was using it myself then, but after a while I was annoyed with the people I was working with for reasons not to be disclosed right now. And I ended up working 3 months in Italy for a little company. They wrote a PHP IDE, and they needed some Xdebug integration with that, so I wrote it for them. And while there, I got contacted by a Norwegian company that did lots of PHP, but I wanted to come and work with them. So the contributions for me to PHP and to the debugger basically got me started, well, getting jobs, right, without having interviews and stuff like that, which is a bit novel. Now, after a while, I got sick of Norway. Again, long story. Moved to the UK, and then I didn't have a job anymore. So I thought, well, I start working for myself. I did lots of contracts, lots of different things, writing PHP extensions of all things. And then one of these contracts was with MongoDB for writing their driver. And that got myself a job. And the moment that happened, I had no time for open source whatsoever, besides the open source driver that I was writing there, because it's a full-time job. Now, after a while, I got annoyed by that, for also reasons that shall be undisclosed, and got back on myself and started writing, got funding of redoing Xdebug for a while, because it was old by that time and it definitely needed improvement. It was slow and non-maintainable, and from there on, I basically started doing that, and then the PHP Foundation started to fund PHP to make sure it is a sustainable language, and I'm contracting for them as part-time as well now. So it's, due to open source, from the start, hacking my own things, getting Shockwave's Flash images centered on my screen, basically kickstarted the whole career, which I had never expected to. I had expected, like many of my classmates, to work for the Infosys and the big consultancy companies, but I'm very glad that I've not ended up there.
And Lorna, how do you find, having worked for such a wide range of, from the big blue chip down to the smaller places, how do you find their support for your maintenance efforts have been, even if it wasn't directly sponsored?
Yeah, it's been an interesting one. I've worked at a bunch of different companies with, all of them had open source libraries that I was working on and contributing to as an engineer, but also, maintaining and doing that kind of care side of things as well. It is amazing to me how many companies will try to hire me and send me a contract that says, we own everything you do, you can't contribute to open source. Like, well, let's try that again. They will always rewrite the contract. It can feel like a risk, but I thoroughly encourage all of you to read the small print and tell people, no, that's not okay. I'm an open source maintainer. This is what I do. The last place I worked actually, which is Redocly, they do a bunch of open source, open API tooling. I was a contributor before I worked there, and then I was a maintainer for a while. Now I don't have commit access anymore, but that doesn't mean I don't fix stuff, right? Because I know their code base, I still use their tools. And they very sweetly tolerate that, which is great. So most places have been fine. As I now look for a new role, understanding that I'm an open API technical steering committee member, I hold that position as an individual, and it would be super helpful to find an employer that can support that important open standards work that so much of the industry depends upon. So finding a place where I can be a force of good for them, but also continue to do the things beyond, like outside the company, to represent them and their interests, and also to try to move us all forward. It's a challenge, but I think it's out there, and it's been a pretty healthy experience all the way along, actually. So it's good.
So you mentioned, standardization there. How important is that in open source? And you're writing libraries and you're writing applications. Where does that interaction with other projects come in? And how important is that standardization not only for APIs and stuff, but the more general ones? So interoperability. Yeah,
standards are very, very important. To be confident developing an open source library, or I guess any library or tool against a standard, you need to have confidence in that standard. And that's why I think it's so important that we focus on open standards. I'm starting to see a bit more recognition of this in public sector, for example. Big companies have known this for a while, but they haven't, in my opinion, been vocal enough about how important that is. Having transparent and open standards means we can hear a lot of voices for input as we evolve that standard. They're all living standards, all the ones I've worked with. And it means that we have this interoperability piece. So you can pick and choose the tools, and you can replace them. So if they are not updating, if you get concerned about the health of that project or the security, because you're using an open standard and everyone's using it, you can replace different parts of your pipeline or your lifecycle setup. So yeah, I think the open standards is really, really, really important, as why I spend so much time and energy on it.
Oh, sorry.
Oh yeah.
Let me add something to that. So one of the things I've added to PHP is daytime support. And that heavily relies on the standard, which is ISO 8601, which is not an open standard. You can't find it online unless you pay like 170 Swiss francs for it. That's not really quite good enough, especially because it is a standard that basically everybody uses, right? So I'd like to see things happening there, but I also can't see the ISO committee just opening this kind of standards, but it really ought to.
So Sam, you've mentioned to me about bringing your opinions to the output of some of your stuff. How does that interact with people trying to make their own changes, and how do you stand up to, opinions, theirs versus yours?
The hardest part of doing open source for me has definitely been occasionally having to tell people no. Like, one of my projects is named Rust Simple Logger. It's there to be as simple as possible as I could get Rust logging to be. And occasionally I've had people go, oh, here's a really complicated feature I'd like to add to this. And I have to go, no. I don't want to maintain that. That's not what the point of this is. Also, I don't even understand it, really. And yeah, it's very hard to tell them no because you don't want to hurt someone's feelings. You don't want to come off as rude, you don't want to start an argument, but also not telling them no means taking on a whole bunch of work, possibly that you have to do more work on, and that what I've realized for a lot of stuff, like if I accept changes, I'm maintaining them potentially for a very long time. Like these libraries that have got any kind of popularity have now been running for about 10 years, and I'm not even sure they were particularly well designed in the first place, but I'm stuck with every decision I made in those pretty much forever. And yeah, that's definitely quite difficult. Not everyone has the same things they want out of your project. Other times I've had people go, oh, there's a CVE that you need to care about in a dependency. You should fix this by breaking something else. And that's a really hard one to navigate because what do you even do there? Well, this clearly needs fixing, but also that might cause a worse issue. And there's two completely conflicting perspectives there. Yeah, I don't have a good answer to what you...
that sounded a great answer. Thanks. You talk about users and their demands. As your projects have gained more popularity, have you found your approach, other than dealing with their demands, have you found the fact that you have users changes your approach to developing?
I actually think that's probably hasn't happened. Like, for most of these projects, the sort of design goal, the thing I want out of them has stayed the same. One of my libraries, Rust PSUtil, that did change a lot over time because people wanted much more out of that than I'd put in. I'd written some very basic stuff for getting process information on Linux. Other people wanted stuff for Macs, stuff for Windows, bits of information from the kernel that weren't available. And none of that was useful to me, but it was useful to other people, so I started accepting stuff and working with other people on that project. It's one of the few projects where I've actually worked with other people and added them as maintainers and admins of the project. So in some cases, yeah, it's changed over time as there are more users. In some cases, not at all.
Lorna, and yourself, and how does interacting with contributors as well, how has that changed what you do in your approach?
I think one of the big things is, I started out as a contributor myself, and I, especially doing open source on behalf of a company, you really have to pretend to be a responsible adult on the internet when you do that. And I think that's given me a lot of insight into what that means in terms of community management and what's the right thing to do. You know, these situations where someone opens a pull request and you don't want to support this until the end of time, right? Either you don't understand it or it just doesn't make sense, it's out of scope. The worst thing you can do is nothing, right? Don't leave that thing hanging, and that took me too long to learn. To close it, always say thank you. To close it and say why is the most kind and healthy thing you can do for your communities. You know, I think if you have a good reason why this doesn't fit in your project or wouldn't be appropriate, you know, you can't support all the scope creep in the world. It's not okay. And yeah, sometimes there are hard decisions to make. We had one a couple of years ago where the distros were telling us, hey, we can't package you anymore because you have this broken thing. And we had to lose a feature because the alternative library didn't support one image format or the other. I've forgotten the details. So we had to actually lose a feature. But the trade-off was that the library was still available in the distros, could still be packaged, could be updated with new versions of Python, and it seemed like an overall win, but it was a hard decision to make at the time.
So, I mean, that sounds like potentially a lot of tugging here, there, you know, a lot of demands on your time that you don't necessarily have the time for. How do you avoid well, I mean...
I didn't avoid burnout.
That's where I was going with that, yeah, there you
I did not avoid burnout. One thing I will say about having people employed to work on open source, so when it's been my day job to spend some of my time with a project, when you're in those roles, whether it's OSPO or DevRel or just engineering, it makes it, you are now responsible for the chop wood carry water aspects of the project, right? One thing we need in open source is a lot of respect for maintainer time, a lot of respect for contributor time. And if you're being paid to do stuff, like, it's your turn to fix the test suite. Like, you can't just cherry pick the best things, and different projects need different things. But feeling like, this isn't my hobby, this isn't what I do for fun, like, I am here to do this in a professional way, even though the code is, you know, I'm collaborating with outside people, then you treat it as well or maybe better than you treat your internal projects. So that kind of changed my perspective as well.
And Derek, how do you avoid burnout?
I go for a walk.
How long do you go for a walk?
Oh, some of the walks are very long, but it's a bit of a facetious answer. But no, sometimes there are periods where there are, well, especially doing Xdebug, which isn't technically working for a company kind of thing. At some point, it's like, I just ignore it for like a month or so, which is maybe not the nicest thing to do, but sometimes you need to be able to step away from things and just focus on other things for a while and go out for a nice long walk maybe. But yeah, I've never really run into that so much, but I've gotten tired of looking at the same thing for a long time for a while, and then just stepping away and doing something else for a while should be totally fine, I'd say.
So kind of talking about some of those pressures, those pulls and pushes, one of the topics that has come up certainly yesterday at the conference was regulation. And you know, people are talking about it in terms of AI and applications, but it does have a very real impact on open source maintainers. And can you talk a bit about what you see coming down the pipe in terms of what's already been enacted, both here and in proper Europe, and so on?
Yeah, so I'm not a lawyer, that I have to say first, but I'm quite interested in these things. I've always been interested in how open source licenses work and stuff like that. So at the moment, from what I can see, there's basically two things that are going to impact open source. And I can't say in how much exactly, because we just don't really know. So in the European Union, there's the Cyber Resilience Act, which is basically a way of making sure that companies act responsible with all kinds of security-related things. I'm sure they have better explanations of what their act is supposed to do, but that is sort of a thing. But that means that projects like the PHP project, we might have to change how we approach security policies. Now, exactly how that is going to change, we don't know yet. So, but that is something that when you start out with your little open source project, you never think about any of these things, right? That at some point you're going to fall some regulation. Specifically in the UK, I think there is a much bigger issue with the current Online Safety Act that Ofcom is consulting on and doing long sessions about, because this is a very complicated piece of legislation which is really, really wide-ranging. The original intent, as far as I understand, and what I've always been saying, is that we want to make the internet the safest as possible in the UK. Now, whatever that might mean, it might mean 4 different things to the 4 different people sitting here around the table, right? But it has far-reaching impacts. Like for XDebug, I self-host my issue tracker. I don't use GitHub issues for that. Mostly because I don't want to move over, because I will lose 23 years of history almost. And also I don't necessarily feel the need to outsource my simple use cases there. But because there's the possibility of having user-to-user contributions and content on there, but you can upload images, screenshot of showing things where it goes wrong, that is now suddenly going to be in scope of the Online Safety Act. Do I have the time to read through 1,200 pages of legalese and the acts and all the guidance? No, I don't, right? So what are my options here? Well, I can either ignore it, which is it's being filmed, so I can't say anything about that. But I can understand that people are just going to ignore this thing existing, and that will be fine, I would reckon, for most smaller organizations. But I also don't really want to have that risk myself, so my options are either to comply, and that might mean having age verification on this, which is, of course, totally out of proportions. Or I can decide to shut it down. And you already see that lots of smaller forums and communities, they have decided we're just not going to comply because we can't afford it. We are not a business, we are not making money, we don't have a lawyer involved, so yeah, we're just going to shut it down, either the whole thing or maybe just for UK visitors. And all these words like visitors and users, they are so vaguely described that you can't even, Ofcom not even defines these things for you. So I think that is going to be an uphill battle for lots of, not only open source projects, but any sort of small communities in the UK and beyond there. So yeah, I'm quite worried about what it's going to do, because the intention is we want to regulate the big social media people. They end up affecting so many smaller organizations, which only option is then to make use of these bigger platforms without a proper moderation and their whatever they're up to. So yeah, I'm upset about this, as you can probably hear.
Someone I know is currently participating in the Ofcom pieces at the moment, and consultations, that's the word. And one of the things that unfortunately comes out is Ofcom's there to interpret and apply the legislation, but not actually tell you what it means. So they can't define what an email is verbatim today. But also, you're in luck, apparently blocking UK visitors is in compliance with OSA.
Yeah, although it's nice to block UK users, it's kind of pointless if you are here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm not quite sure how that is going to help. But
Lorna, did any of these kind of wider geopolitical things or local geopolitical things, do they have a chilling effect on any of the stuff you do, or do you see that in anyone yet?
Right now, I would say I feel horrified, but the projects that I maintain are very code-oriented, they're on GitHub, so I probably can just coast for most of them, but I run a small community which is for women of open source, and there's a non-zero chance that we're going to shut that down. It's massively global, but both of the organizers are based here in the UK, and so it's very UK-centric. This thing is only 2 years old. We cooked it up coming back from FOSDEM 2 years ago. We should be having a birthday party. And instead we're, I don't know, planning a wake. So I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. It is a private thing, but you know, there are so many things in our communities where it's becoming harder to do those things, and also harder to reach the next generation in lots of ways, because they are funneled into the the big platforms. And there's some of this stuff that if you mention any alternative platforms on the mainstream ones, your account gets banned. And so yes, the whole thing is very horrifying, and I'm going to stop talking before I can't stop talking.
Yay, doom. So, there's been a lot of negativity just for now, and, contributing and maintaining these things are always going to have their downs. But what about the ups? Have you found, Sam, that there's been a positive experience in maintaining your own stuff and putting it out there?
Yeah, I mostly do it for my own joy in it and going, I've made a thing. Here, I can share it to people. Maybe they'll find it cool. Sometimes it's cool to be able to go back, 5 years and go, here's a thing I did here, and here's how I solved a problem. And I don't have to get permission from a past company or just go, I can't remember how I did that. And occasionally I've had interviews or met people and they go, oh, I use your thing. And I just sit there going, you've heard of me? That's, I don't know how to deal with that. I'm not prepared to be any kind of public figure, but it is nice. And it is, I've always liked the spirit of open source of we're giving things to each other for free, and they don't have to be important or big or that serious. They can just be something someone made in their spare time, and I really like that. I want to see more of the open source that is just, here's a thing someone made, whether they think people can use it or not.
How do you think we can encourage more people to get into putting their stuff out there? If we've got some chilling effects, how do we counteract that, and how do we make it more accessible?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I have any good answers there, but I think part of it is encouraging people to do open source, not just because you're building something for someone else to use, but because it's an easy way to share stuff. I'd encourage people to put their half-finished projects on GitHub, that thing they made one day for a hackathon. It's open source isn't just a space for the really big corporate, well-funded, well-maintained projects. It's a space for anything and everything, whether it's alive or dead. One of the things I love is when occasionally you get companies like NASA will go and open source really old code they did, and that is fascinating to people because we can then go and look back, a history of how people were coding a long time ago in a very different situation, and that's some of the coolest code you can find online now.
Yeah. So Lorna, how can more people get involved?
So I think we are seeing some changes, and I feel I'm overstating it to say that we're part of the resistance, but I think there's something there about people looking at their data sovereignty and their own personal privacy. I personally am trying to de-billionaire myself, and they're technical, but they're not hardcore open source people looking to self-host. And there's more products that are open source. You can self-host. It's available as a service. And it means that you've got all the convenience of somebody's selling your data, but you can just pay for the hosting as a service. So I think that's going to be a good gateway. Some of you are old enough to remember all the things that we built on GeoCities and those kinds of things. So as we start to come into these shared hackable platforms for good reason, money going in places that we care about, moving to Mastodon and being responsible about how we put ourselves out into the world, I wonder if that's our way in. Also, this is only tangentially related, but you love a tangent, so I'm going to go anyway. Could you all please write more about your stuff? I love to read the words as well as the code. There's a lot of nonsense on the internet, and I wish that some of you were letting your not nonsense out to somewhere. Put it in a gist, I don't care. But just write it down, write about what you did, write about how you solved a problem. It'll save me so much time because I'll be able to find it. I have always been a big blogger. It's helped me to think, to communicate. People can ask me stuff, and I can't remember, but I wrote it down, so then I look like a genius. It's brilliant. And I would love to see more of that because I think it is a very good way in, and it's part of my story as well, for sure.
And also I know plenty of people who come across a problem, search for it, and then realize that they wrote the answer to the problem down 5 years ago and they're the top result. And
Guilty.
I know that happens to you, Lorna.
Constantly. I absolutely love it. I use a search engine and lornajane.net is in the results and you're like, get in, past Lorna. And it's great because I had a problem and I pasted the error message and I pasted the command that I fixed it with. So then 5 years later, here's the error message. It's caused me to find it in the search results. Here's the command that I used to fix it. I mean, all the paths are correct for my system. It uses words that I understand, and I just put the command back where I got it from, and off we go. It's amazing.
Yeah, in a world where like AI and Google and synthesized information is becoming increasingly common, please do write about the stuff you're doing and how you solve problems, even if they seem really, really small. Like I've got blog posts that are just like, what's the difference between these two things in Kubernetes? And they're like 5 lines long. And I've referenced that, and that kind of information is so useful to me because so much of the internet now is full of, well, junk, slop, stuff that is completely incomprehensible and wasn't ever really had a human trying to communicate something involved. And so all those tiny blog posts and things with people solving problems, they are some of the most valuable information out there. And I think they often get missed in the conversation about open source, which talks a lot about.
So sorry to rush you, Derek, but we're running out of time. So if you can, squish.
You still got comments from me. Writing things is important. I mean, I do it myself. I also find some of my old blog posts back when searching for a problem. But I think it's important to make sure that you also own this content. Because I see so much disappear behind Slack, behind Discord, Medium, all kinds of proprietary platforms. Now, Lorna was saying that there is a bit of a resurgence of self-hosting, and that seems to revolve mostly around the Fediverse in some way. But I'm still a little bit afraid that that isn't reaching the generations below us quite just yet. And I think we need to figure out a way on how to do that, because I think that is going to be important.
So if you've got any ideas about that, or if you just want to maintain or contribute, please do walk up to any three of these fantastic panelists. Thank you very much, Sam, Lorna, and Derek.